Chair of the Northside Lake CHB. I welcome Carol to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. And I want to send a little thank you out to the co-organizers of this conference and to point out for folks that the title of this conference is Communities Building Hope. And for me, the greatest hope when you have people like the Ally Center who are on the ground with people in poverty, and people from the university system who are studying and working at a policy level that some of us don't have access to. So the marriage of a community health board volunteer with a CBU professor to host a conference, I think is a wonderful first step. You always have to have a little lead-in to your presentation, and our lead-in came from one of our frustrated questioners. Yes, we all understand how deep this problem runs in our community, but where do we go from here? Where are some of the ideas of things that we can start? And I can think of no other place to start when you think about poverty than with income. You say basic income. Income is basic. If you don't have enough to meet your needs, all the creativity in the world doesn't solve that problem. So we're delighted today to have two interveners that are going to help us walk through some thoughts about what is basic income and how it might work. So I'm going to introduce them to you. The first one is Mandy K. Rainingbird. Mandy is a speech pathologist and a retired professor in the School of Communication Sciences at Dalhousie University. She's a longtime proponent of basic income as a poverty elimination strategy, advocating through her roles as chair of the Basic Income Nova Scotia and a member of the Canadian Coalition for Basic Income. Her colleague, Pierre is also a retired professor. He grew up in the Netherlands, and when he came to Canada in 1973, taught for 33 years, primarily as a senior instructor in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics at Dalhousie University. He is treasurer of Basic Income Canada and Basic Income Nova Scotia, and he advocates for our obligation to ensure a fair standard of living for all. I'm just delighted that we have a combination of a healthcare professional and a mathematician that are going to help explain a very complex, solution-focused approach to poverty. So I welcome to the floor Mandy K. Rainingbird and Pierre Stevens.
Thank you very much, Carol. I appreciate that. And we really appreciate, I'm going to just take this off. We really appreciate you asking us here to participate in this conference. If the rest of the conference is as wonderful as it's begun, we're all in for a real treat. So. And this is, of course, such an important issue to be trying to network around and understand. I wanted to mention, before I get started, that my name is Mandy K. Rainingbird, as was stated, and sometimes that's a bit misleading for people. They wonder whether I'm Indigenous. I am not. But I was married to an Indigenous man. Our two children are Indigenous. They're members of the Chippewa Cree tribe, as it's called, in Rocky Boy, Montana. Both of them are living now in Halifax and have been living there for a very long time. And my daughter is married to a Mi'kmaq man from Millbrook. So personally, I have many connections, but I myself am not Indigenous. I also wanted to mention that as I move through my talk, I'm going to be talking about the social assistance system or the income assistance system here in Nova Scotia, but that is not the income assistance system and social assistance system that exists on reserves, as we have heard a little bit earlier. Basic Income Nova Scotia just finished a conference down in Halifax. Some of you may have attended some or all of that conference. Mike Calloway actually gave some opening remarks for it, which we really appreciate. And there are champions in government, including Mike Calloway for basic income, and including Jaime Batiste. So we really, really appreciate the work that they are doing at that level. But Naomi Metallic, who is a co-author on one of the documents that's being passed out today, spoke at our conference, and she described the shameful history of social assistance on reserves and how it differs from the social assistance systems in provinces, and how underfunded it is relative to the horribly underfunded social assistance systems in our provinces. So I would encourage you, when we have the recorded presentations online, to listen to that presentation. It's really, really excellent. So with no further ado, I will try to talk to you about what a basic income is, why I feel it's needed, and what I believe it could do based upon the research that's out there. And then I'm going to pass the baton to Pierre, who's going to talk about, is it affordable? People ask, is it affordable? Yes, it is affordable, and he'll explain why. So the basic income we want, I think it's really of critical importance when we first talk about basic income to describe the basic income that we're talking about, because there's a number of notions of what a basic income is out there. So in Basic Income Nova Scotia, which, as was mentioned, is a member of Coalition Canada Basic Income and is affiliated with Basic Income Canada Network, we all agree that we are advocating for a progressive basic income. A basic income that is a poverty elimination strategy and can be briefly defined in the following way: a direct payment from government to ensure that everyone has sufficient income to meet their basic needs, participate in society, and live with dignity regardless of work status. As I mentioned, there's a number of different notions of what a basic income is, so I wanted to emphasize that the basic income we advocate for is not a replacement of the social safety net that currently exists. It is an essential component of a comprehensive social safety net that should exist for people in Nova Scotia and throughout Canada. And that acknowledges that along with the basic income and the current supports that exist, there need to be changes with those supports, as people today have already very poignantly mentioned, and there need to be additional supports. We all know, for example, that mental health needs additional money and supports for people who struggle with those difficulties. The basic income that we advocate for is not going to be provided to the wealthy. It's going to be provided to people who need it. So it will be income tested. It will be gradually reduced as earned income is increased, but it will not be provided for everybody. That's the one we advocate for. The Coalition Canada group is made up of advocacy groups across all of the provinces and territories, and we've all agreed with the following principles, some of which overlap with what I have already said. One of those principles is that it should be universally accessible. That sounds like it's given to everybody, but again, what that means is it's given to those who need it. It should be unconditional, subject only to income and residency requirements, and therefore not means tested and subjected to all of the scrutiny and oversight that's current income assistance systems engage in. It should be an essential component of a broad safety net, as I said before, and it must be sufficient. That means that it must provide enough money for people to not be living in poverty. And it should be enhanced for people with specific difficulties, for example, disabilities, and it should be indexed to the cost of living so that it continues to stay in line with the cost of living. It should be responsive to changing circumstances, so indexing is part of that, but also it needs to be able to be administered in a nimble way, maybe bi-weekly, maybe monthly, so that when individuals find themselves in changing circumstances, the basic income can be brought in. It should respect autonomy, and that refers to being payable to individuals to be used at their sole discretion. It's nobody's business but their own, what they spend their money on. And it must respect Indigenous rights, Indigenous autonomy, and Indigenous self-determination. It should that means that it respects the rights of Indigenous people to determine whether a basic income is delivered in their communities, and if so, what form it will take and how it will be implemented. And we feel that this last statement is consistent with the calls for justice of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report, which two of the calls for justice were for, one, a basic income for everybody in Canada, and two, to work with the Inuit to ensure that the model of a basic income was appropriate for the community. I debated whether to put these pictures here because I don't want to I don't want to dehumanize people with the use of this type of picture, but I wanted to emphasize that with the basic income, Basic Income Nova Scotia believes that in a society as wealthy as ours, it is a violation of human rights and common decency for any child or any adult to live in poverty. And these are some of the circumstances people are forced to live in. The fact that we have poverty in this country is a policy choice. And we can do better, we can do differently, and a basic income can be part of that. I want to just pause for a moment and let people, I was going to ask you to yell it out, but think just to yourselves about what it feels like to be living in poverty. How would you describe that? How would you feel as an individual? And many of you probably have had that personal experience. Yes? Exhausting. Others? Embarrassing. Scared. Powerless. Trapped. Hungry, many times. Some of what you've said is embodied in some of these descriptors here. It negatively impacts our sense of well-being. It negatively impacts our health. It negatively impacts our mental health. our physical health. So that moves me to, why do we need a basic income? That's one reason. We need a basic income for many reasons, I believe. Too many people are struggling. We've heard about some of them today: the homeless, the unemployed, those on social assistance, those in precarious work. We need it because poverty rates are high, as Leslie Frank talked about. In the latest Child and Family report card, 24.6% of Nova Scotian children were reported to be living in poverty. And as she mentioned in her talk, Cape Breton communities are more impacted than that. We need it because some groups are particularly vulnerable. This particular figure shows that Indigenous people off reserve, that there was no data in this particular study for Indigenous people on reserve. Recent immigrants, people with disabilities, single parents, all are vulnerable, more vulnerable to poverty, as we all know. I'm sure everybody in this room knows. What I always find really striking and disturbing is the far right bar, where we're looking at unattached people 45 to 64 years of age. So these are people who are supposedly able to be employed. And that may or may not be true for a whole variety of reasons, but they are most vulnerable and they are most left out. We need it because poverty is racialized, as was mentioned earlier as well. These data do contrast poverty rates of individuals on reserve, the blue lines, off reserve, Indigenous people off reserve, the black lines, and then the general public across various provinces or groups of provinces. And you can see just the dramatic difference in poverty rates of individuals who are Indigenous and on reserve. And to the left, you can see some data for African Nova Scotians and how they also experience dramatically higher levels of poverty than the general public. And these, of course, reflect the systemic racism and colonial impacts that have been discussed to a certain degree today as well. We need it because income assistance is inadequate, as has been said before, and this is the latest Nova Scotia income assistance figures. It's $686. How are you supposed to live on that in a month? And the enhanced rate for people with disabilities and some other people, $950. In the discussion we had, in the conference we had in Halifax, first voice person and anti-poverty activist and advocate, and a person with a disability, all together, talked about how difficult it was to live on $950 a month. And he talked about things like social isolation, as was so poignantly discussed by the nurse a little bit earlier, as well as many other struggles that he went through. Yeah, so basic income, income assistance is totally inadequate, and this provides you with, if you look at the red square, a little bit of information about how inadequate it is, and Leslie Frank talked about this as well. For a single person considered employable, then they actually get an amount this is a couple of years old, but it's not changed that much. an amount that's 38% of the market basket measure, one measure of poverty. 38%. And it's not changed over a very long period of time. Leslie Frank talks about the frustration of doing the report over and over again and things not changing. Well, this figure shows you that as well. Since 1989, no substantive change. And some of you probably are familiar with the transformational process that supposedly took place in social assistance or income assistance in Nova Scotia, led by the Department of Community Services, and Vince Calderhead did an analysis following the end of the transformation that showed that real substantive changes in what people were taking home did not take place based upon that. And in fact, some people, you could probably guess, adults who are considered employable actually are doing worse. Why is it necessary? Because poverty is expensive. It's extremely expensive. This slide shows that people in the lowest quintile, those who receive the lowest income, the fifth of society that receives the lowest incomes, actually are more expensive for our public health care system than by quite a lot than those who are in the highest quintile, the fifth quintile, which is at the bottom there. And that was discussed by the nurse today as well, how the appalling conditions people are living in, and when they come to a hospital, for example, the needs that they have are quite severe oftentimes. Yeah, in fact, and this was mentioned before in this recent report from CCPA, a calculation of the total cost of poverty in Nova Scotia per year was above $2 billion. So we're willing to cover those costs. We're willing to cover those costs. That goes back to, this is a policy choice. This is a policy choice. Why do we need it? Because it damages health and well-being. Hugh Segal, who was a conservative senator of Canada, but was and continues to be a very strong advocate for a basic income, said, poverty is the best predictor of early illness, early hospitalizations, longer hospital stays, and earlier death. It is a reliable predictor of substance abuse, food insecurity, poor education outcomes, and for some, trouble with the law. This doesn't need to be a partisan issue. This is an interesting, I'm sure many of you have seen this before, this is an interesting infographic from the Canadian Medical Association, and it highlights the health needs, what makes Canadians sick, and their sources. And you can see in this infographic that a very small percentage of what makes us sick in Canada has to do with our biology, and a very large percentage of what makes us sick in Canada has to do with the social determinants of health. The life circumstances that you grow up and live with throughout. Your access to health care, the environment, and how toxic that environment is for you. It's important because income is, in my opinion, the most important social determinant of health. Income is the means of gaining access to other social determinants of health, such as education, food, housing, recreational activities, and other societal resources, as people have already mentioned today. I'm really not saying anything that hasn't been already said, maybe. It's important because the damaging effect of poverty that I've been talking about are racialized as well. This is a study from the United States, but the same statements can be made, I believe, about people in Canada. And it looked at the data for over 58 years, and the conclusions of the author was racial and ethnic disparities in children's health are extensive, pervasive, persistent, and in some cases worsening. 58 years they looked at these data. Well, we need it because poverty kills. The mortality rates for people in quintiles lower than the highest quintile are higher. As you move down in income, if you look at the figure on the right, lower incomes are at the bottom, higher incomes at the top. As you move down these quintiles, mortality rates increase. In fact, the authors of this particular study suggested that 40,000 preventable deaths per year are occurring in the 4 quintiles below the highest quintile. 40,000 per year. And of course, the largest difference, the largest difference is in the second to lowest quintile and the lowest quintile. Why do we need it? Because the current system mistreats people. We act like some people deserve our help and others do not. We act like people who are on income assistance are trying to scam the system, so we have to oversee them and scrutinize everything they do. We act like poverty is the individual's fault, as was discussed earlier today. They could get a job, they could get a better job, they could try harder, do more, stop being so lazy. You've all heard it, but jobs aren't always available. Unemployment rates in Nova Scotia are high. Eastern Nova Scotia, 12.3% right now. Western Nova Scotia, 8.4%. Halifax, 7.2%. Too many jobs are precarious. So even if you have a job, it could be a part-time job, could be contract, temporary work, could be that you have to cobble together multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. Could be that you have variable hours, which is very difficult if you have children, especially non-unionized, no benefits, low pay, 1 paycheck away from poverty. 50% of people in this study, Toronto and Hamilton, only 50% around have permanent full-time work with benefits. That's shocking. So why do we need it? Because paid work does not protect you from poverty. Here's a calculation that I did of if you worked full-time on minimum wage, which is now $12.95 in Nova Scotia, and your income before taxes I calculated to be about $22,800 a year. And then in the red box, depending on family size, as you go down from 1, 2 to 4, you can see the low income cutoff points. So you can see that that job isn't going to do much for families who have multiple children. Why do we need it? Because precarious workers are often powerless and have limited rights. Because not all work is paid work, and we should value all work. Because the majority of Canadians want it. This is a study that was done in January 2021, the Angus Reid poll that shows that in every province except Alberta, and actually another study in Alberta showed a flip picture there, there's substantial numbers of people who support a basic income relative to those who don't. So how would a basic income help? This is a basic income would dramatically reduce poverty by providing an income floor for everybody when they need it. We have targeted income programs, so we've been able to study them. We know what the impact of some of those programs are. CERB, the Canada Child Benefit, the Old Age Security and Guaranteed. I'm just going to go over into Pierre's time. No, Old Age Security and Guaranteed Income Supplement, and what's presumably coming is the Canada Disability Benefit. So we know CERB was not a basic income. Some of the reasons that I wouldn't call it a basic income are that it was instituted reactively, not proactively. It should be there when you need it. There were many gaps in it, though to the government's credit, a lot of those gaps they tried to fill once they recognized them. It was temporary, not permanent. And it disincentivized work because it was clawed back at a very high rate when people began to have paid income again. But it was meant to disincentivize work because we were in the middle of a pandemic and people were supposed to stay home. But CERB did demonstrate, as some other people said, that governments could act quickly, swiftly, nimbly, that there could be a simple application process and distribution process, that it eliminated punitive means testing, and that it identified a level that presumably provided for people's basic needs. Now that could be debated what exactly that level is, but it's certainly $2,000 a month, a lot better than that $680 a month we were looking at before, or that $980 a month, right? Old age security and guaranteed income, if you look at the green line that goes down, it shows you the reduction in poverty of people 65 and over on the with the institution of this basic income-like benefit. Doesn't reach zero. That's because it needs to be higher, I believe, to a certain degree, and because it doesn't get indexed adequately to changes in some research has shown that after the introduction of GIS, food insecurity rates dropped from 22 to 11%. Health improved, and that's despite the fact that these people that they were studying were all getting older and older. Studies show that basic income does not discriminate, that it has little effect on paid work engagement, despite the myth out there that it will be a disincentive for work. The research shows that is not true. There's only a small number of people who choose not to work with the basic income, and they tend to be people who've gone back to school or people who have chosen to take care of family members or other people in the home. It decreases healthcare costs. The study by Evelyn Forget of the Mincome Project showed 8.5% of health or hospital visits and doctor's visits were reduced with the basic income, and that reflected a reduction primarily in injury and in mental health difficulties. It improves housing safety and quality. It increases people's sense of well-being and trust in government, a good thing. It stimulates urban and rural economies. Money, of course, stays in the communities. People who are receiving a basic income aren't going to the Bahamas. All work's valued. People have economic security. People can take risks. People have choices. Ferdowsi and his colleagues, who published a 2020 study on the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, stated, for a significant number of participants, basic income purportedly proved to be transformational, fundamentally reshaping their living standards as well as their sense of self-worth and hope for a better future. Basic income's not a panacea, of course. Other things need to be changed. That's absolutely true. But basic income can help in very, very important ways. We have a housing crisis right now. This research showed that nearly 60% of people who were involved in the basic income pilot in Ontario improved their housing circumstances as a result of receiving a basic income. That's just one example. So that's the end of what I'm going to say, and I'm going to hand it over to Pierre. I have here a number of resources that I would encourage people to access. I'm sure these slides will be made available. The Case for Basic Income series and frequently asked questions can be good, really sort of short stop places for you to go. And I would also call on you to add your voices if you also agree that a basic income is important. Now is the time, I believe. There is a critical mass developing. Add your voices, talk to your politicians, and let's get this thing done. So with that, Pierre.
Thank you, and thank you all for inviting me here to speak. That way I don't have to wear this for a little while.
It's this one here.
Okay, thanks. And so before I actually go into my talk, just very briefly, Mandy talked a little bit about a proactive basic income, and I wanted to point, we've seen COVID-19 and the need for a basic income reaction. What I want to point out is, with us wanting to transition to a greener economy, there will be other, shall we say, problems that we're going to have to deal with, because when we do social engineering on this scale, there will be fundamental problems, and maybe referring to closing the coal mines, or maybe referring to shutting down the fisheries, gives people some idea about the consequences of that kind of social engineering. And it is hugely important that before we really get onto that road, that we have a basic income in place, because it will provide people with a sense of income security when they are faced on an individual level with having their core personality being destroyed because their careers come to an end, their communities come to an end, etc., etc. It's important that we now start putting that in place so that we are prepared for what's coming in the future. So, now we get to my part of the talk. Can we afford a basic income? And I'm, as a ex-mathematician, I like to work with numbers, I like to work with ideas, I like to work with patterns, I like to work with problems, and I like to see how we can come up with solutions. That's what a mathematician does. So I like to talk in that kind of framework about how we can afford a basic income. I will cover the cost of poverty, then I have some perspectives on the word afford. Then I digress in a brief history of taxation, because I think it is important, if we talk about basic income, to understand what has happened in the past, probably in the past 40 years. Then I talk about policy options in terms of what kinds of basic income models do exist, and then I will talk a little bit about economic benefits, and hopefully at the end of the talk I have convinced you all that a basic income is great. But let's see. We'll talk about that at the end. Oh, the cost of poverty. So the first thing I want to show you is this number. Any idea what this number is? That's the number of people in Nova Scotia on income assistance. Actually, that's not true, because I assume that this is a number of adults, so it doesn't include the number of children that are living in poverty. It doesn't include the enormous poverty rates that exist in the indigenous communities, etc., because the data is not there. So, sorry, let me get back to that number, 39,000. That's the number of people, through policy choice, we put in a living hell on earth. And we have heard about that from Sharon, we've heard from Tuma about that, we have heard from Leslie about that, and I could keep quoting things that they have said that constantly will come up. These people we put by policy choice in a living hell on earth. Consequences of poverty are premature death, Mandy talked about that, increased health costs, she talked about that, increased judicial costs, like for instance legal aid, like for instance incarceration, like for instance direct expenditures for courthouses, prisons, judges, you name it, you know, like what's not been sort of, as I calculated, is the cost of the victims of poverty-related judicial expenses. There is another cost, and that is the loss of economic productivity, either because people because they come from a low income, they have a poor education, they cannot get jobs, or they end up with, shall we say, a criminal career, etc. Anyway, loss of economic productivity is huge. I was going to give an example of my own having had the luck to go have post-secondary education because I grew up in Holland and it was free. The choice, if I didn't have that, was working in the coal mines. As a result, I really feel that I have had the luxury of having a great economic productivity. Well, maybe working in the coal mines would have done that too. I don't know. The cost of poverty comes to something like $80 billion in 2014. So it's probably now at somewhere around $100 billion if we add all those things up. That's around 6% of the GDP. And for instance, for Ontario, I got this number that it is roughly $2,500 per household that they have to pay extra for the cost. Mandy already mentioned that. I like to look at the numbers, okay? Because that's what you pay extra for having a policy that keeps people poor. So a reality check. We have an income assistance program, oh yeah, I can see it here, which costs us roughly $300 million a year, a budget line. Sorry, that is in Nova Scotia, $300 million a year. If we look at Canada, it probably comes to $9 billion a year, what the provinces pay to keep people in poverty. Federal spending, in terms of income redistribution, is probably around $33 billion, and that includes things like GST rebates, low income tax credits, etc. Okay? Now, what does that roughly $40 billion that we spend on keeping people poor by things called income assistance programs, what does that give us? It gives us a 12% poverty rate, 4.5 million people in Canada. And by the way, that number goes up and down, like Leslie said, you know, and sometimes we praise ourselves on the back and sometimes not. But systemically, we are not doing anything about eradicating poverty. Many people will die prematurely. It costs us an additional $80 billion because we have a piss poor program. Sorry, excuse my language. And the only thing we do is tinker with the system at the edges by doing little incremental increases. So this status quo has been going on for at least 40 or 50 years, at least as long since I have been in Canada. So my question to you is this government policy a success or is it a failure? I leave that up to you to decide. Okay? Well, there it does it again. There we go. So, I want to come now on. So we know what the cost is of poverty, of having a bad policy choice. Can we afford a basic income? Well, let me ask you, can we afford the existing income assistance program? Oh yeah, that was up to you to decide. So I will not answer that question. So can we afford a basic income? What I want to do first is reflect for a moment on the part of the word afford in there. Because the word afford involves choice. And when we talk about choice, I think it gets messy. It gets very messy because affordability gets measured on sometimes not on logical decisions. And remember, I was a mathematician. So, is affordability a valid question? And I think no, because there are compelling arguments that it is a human right. And you can see that from Article 25.1. Everybody should have a livelihood, even if the circumstances are beyond his control, for an adequate living. So to me, that is an interpretation of a human right. And if we have a human right, we don't discuss affordability. We don't do it with healthcare. We don't do it with senior support. We don't do it with childcare. Okay? It's a right. It's a universal right. Affordability does not come into the question. Secondly, do we ask the same questions of other programs? For instance, if we look at the defense budget, when Canada decided to go and join the invasion of Iraq, nobody said, can we afford that? Wait a moment, let's discuss this for 40 years. No, bang, done. You know, when CERP came around, bang, done. Sometimes good, sometimes not good, you know, and say, corporate welfare. Oh, we find many, many reasons to really say they deserve it, you know. Let's say like whatever that company is that flies airplanes around and so on, you know, they deserve $300 million, you know. Let's say Northern Pulp deserves $300 million, you know. Pipeline deserves $5 million. We find reasons. Yet we cannot find any reason to get people out of poverty because, oh, we can't afford it. So another question about affordability is, who really makes the choices? You know, who answers the questions? Are it the people in poverty or are it the 1%ers? Well, I think I know the answer, but I'll let you think about that. Okay, who makes a choice and who has a voice? Where is the democratic representation of 4.5 million people living in poverty? Where was poverty on the party platforms during the last election? Okay, so to me, let's forget about the question about can we afford it. Let's go to logical decision making. What does it cost? Where can we get the revenue from? And what can we do if we don't have enough revenue? So, before I go into that, a very quick detour in the history of Canada taxation. Did you know that before 1916 there was no personal income tax, there was no corporate income tax in Canada? The only thing was excise and customs tax. We got World War I and we needed money to keep the war effort going, so we got the income war tax, and we created corporate tax and personal income tax, and that was a document of 10 pages, and it was to raise money to finance the war. It took up till 1949 because before that law got changed in the income tax law, and also its purpose changed. It became the redistribution of income was a dominant feature of the income tax, of modern tax legislation. And today, the tax system is used to do social objectives, to do economic objectives, and to have political objectives. And sometimes they include things like, you know, making sure that people vote for you. And the document is 3,500 pages. it's based on two principles, and the first one is horizontal equity, being that people with the same income pay the same kind of taxes if they are in the same circumstances. It's a lofty principle, but it's a very tough one. Oh, sorry. There's also vertical equity, meaning that people with high income should pay more of a share. Oops. Did I say that? Reality check, okay? So, people with high incomes can put their money into assets and therefore have no incomes and therefore pay no taxes. Okay? So, over the years, there are now many incentives, such as tax credits, that have basically created a complex, distorted, biased, and complicated system. And those are not my words. Those are words from the Canadian Bar Association and the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants, who complain about the horizontal and vertical principles being violated. So, one very simple thing, and I already gave the example, is how do we define income? Well, you know, say like your paycheck gets defined as income. But if you have money coming from, for instance, capital gains, ooh, we're going to treat that differently. If you have money coming from investments, ooh, we're going to treat them different. Guess which quintile that applies to? The people with money. Okay. I'll give an example of a horizontal sort of problem, which it may be good, may be bad, but you know, it's a complicated system. Most income redistributions that we came up with in terms of tax credits are not taken up by the people with no income or low income, but by the people with middle and upper income. And those are studies done by Stats Canada, by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, etc. It's not things that we make up. Okay, 1966, we got the Carter Reform, which says we have to have another look at the tax system. And they came up with this notion of a buck is a buck, meaning it doesn't matter where the income comes from, we should all be taxing it the same, which is in direct confrontation with the existing practice, and that is you tax income according to the source where it comes from, and it is biased towards the people that have lots of money. And I mean, we all know the word trickle-down effect, right? Oh, give the tax breaks to the rich, then they can do things, and eventually the poor will benefit. Surprise, surprise, the evidence is totally the contrary. I mean, the income inequality has increased. So this is important to keep in mind, that revenue generation on the federal government side or on the provincial side has been corrupted to the benefit not of the poor. Okay, globalization adds another problem to it, because now we get international tax laws, and the result is a system so complicated. By the way, if you can't read it, don't worry, because you have access to the slides. The conclusion is that now corporate tax can simply do tax avoidance, and not only that, they can place themselves outside of the arms of the Canadian government and never even pay taxes that they should pay. So we know, and again, it's a Parliamentary Budget Office. It's not just some left-wing radical communist group that comes up with this. It's a Parliamentary Budget Office that says that nearly $1 trillion get moved from Canadian corporations to offshore destinations and avoid paying taxes. Now let me see, if I make $600 a month, how much can I move to Bermuda? You know? It also, Canada Revenue Agents reported the same year that $26 billion a year in terms of tax revenue is outside of the influence of the Canadian government, and they can't force the people to pay that. So we know there's $51 billion that the government, through policy, allows to disappear out of our revenue coffers. You know, I'd say like I would assume that where there's a will, there's a way, and you could do something about it, but it's complex. So, that was for a moment the tax history. And what I want you to get from it is how totally unfair it has been to people living in the lower quintile, and how incredibly in favor it is of for the people that have a voice and that can influence the choice. Okay? So, now I want to talk about basic income models and what kind of policy options we have. And the reason why I talked about the tax system is because maybe some of these policy choices include having to raise taxes or having to generate revenue, let's call it that way. Or maybe not. We don't know. But let's just keep being open-minded about that. Or maybe just have the pendulum swing a little bit back to the other side in favor of people who deserve it, who need it the most. So, how much will the National Basic Income Guarantee cost? And I'll start out again with the Parliamentary Budget Office, which costed the Ontario pilot project and answered the question, how much would this program cost if we did it on a federal level? And they came up with $76 billion in April 2019, and they said that can be offset by already similar things that we're already doing, and that reduces us to $43 billion. So that's what it would cost. Now, Dr. Evelyn Forget said, no, not so quick, you don't say, because there's also provincial money that goes into income assistance, etc. And if we offset that amount too, then a basic income program would cost $23 billion. Okay, $23 billion is similar to the Canada Child Benefit. So we can eradicate poverty in Canada for $23 billion. Can we afford $23 billion? Okay, I don't know. So, now, the Parliamentary Budget Office is restricted in what they can do. They can only do the number crunching, and they are not allowed to make any decisions about policy changes or suggestions about what and how. In other words, they cannot be creative. So, a little bit more has happened in the last couple of years, and various academic models have come up that don't have these restrictions that the Parliamentary Budget Office has. And they looked at the tax system and they said, we can have a cost-neutral system if the federal government and the provinces work together. We can have a basic income for probably $20,000 a year, and it doesn't need tax changes in the sense of tax reforms like the kind of things that that I mentioned of what has happened in the past. You only have to tinker a bit with tax credits, say in the terms of have them go to the right kind of groups of people. And if you do that, you can have a cost-neutral model, i.e. we can put $20,000 a year in the hands of poor people, and it doesn't have to change anything in terms of the parliamentary budget. Well, but isn't there that income assistance program? Wasn't that a wonderful program? Shouldn't we stay with that? It's a policy option. It's a decision that we can make just like that. No. Now, Basic Income Canada Network went one step further, and they said, look, why don't we create a policy option that is a little bit more than what the academic models do, and it has to be cost neutral, it has to progressively structured, and they said $24,000 a year, or we said $24,000 a year, and lo and behold, CURB came around, and what was CURB? $24,000 a year. So we're on the right track. But they said, not only that, now we're pushing the system a little bit, we are also embracing progressively funding. And what does that mean? Progressively funding means that we are looking at changes into the tax system, if needed, tax reform, including, having a look at income and vertical equity. And so our model may include, for instance, a 1% increase in the tax rate for the richest people. It includes an increase in corporate tax, because if we look over the last probably 30 years, how much corporate tax pays less and has put that burden on households, it's enormous. It's enormous. And nobody complains because these people need it. Okay. The model had a couple of things that they wanted to meet, and one of them is sort of working towards gender equity, working towards no one left behind, making sure that there will also be income security for the lower and middle incomes, so to the point where even people up to 50,000 and 60,000 will still have some benefits from a basic income program because of the way the clawbacks would work. And we are ensuring that the corporations and the wealthiest will start paying a little bit more of a fair share. Okay, so the conclusion was, now notice all of these, except for the first one by the Parliamentary Budget Office, none of them needed debt funding. So we have a bunch of models that are there to be chosen from, or that can be mixed up or so on. All of them are immensely better policy responses to income security than the one that we have. I'm not finished. Oh, sorry, I have to be finished, I guess, very quickly. There's huge amounts of economic benefits, because the models that we have been working with up to now only looked at static information, and that was, if we want to give people money, how much shall it be? But there has been no dynamic economic study been done about what are the consequences of putting that putting that money into the economy. Like, for instance, the equivalent of $100 million a year in the Victoria, Sydney federal riding. So, basic income is more than affordable. I shouldn't use the word affordable, but there it is. I use affordable like a positive idea. We know from the Canada Child Benefit that it costs around $23 billion, and it generates economic benefits up to $46 billion, as the Bank of Canada president has said it increased the economy by 0.5% each year. So we know this money that you put in the economy generates things. But since May 18, 2021, there's a new report out by the Canada Centre for Economic Analysis, and they did a dynamic economic impact study of what would happen if a basic income would be in place. And what they said is, we look at a number of different basic income models, and we run them through a simulator for 25 years, and we see what happens with all kinds of economic factors. Basic income will grow the economy by $32 to $62 billion a year. That depends on what model you have. If everything is paid for by household taxes, or if some of it is paid by corporate taxes, or if some of it is paid by debt funding. The funniest thing is government debt funding, I think, turned out to give the biggest bang for a buck, sorry. Okay, basic income is good for business. So not only is it good for the people that get that basic income, but for the communities in which that money is spent. And we see something like that, it would be $12 to $13 billion a year if money gets spent in that community. Here's a number that what would come into, for instance, the Sydney Victoria riding. I use numbers about, what the number of adult population is, what sort of they would roughly get, and so on. And I came up with something like $99 million would go into the economy here per year. When was the last time you heard about a program like that? Anyone? Basic income is also good for labor. It will raise not taxes, it will raise salaried income by, like a certain percentage per year. Why? Because there will be more economic activity, there will be demand for people to keep the supply chain going, blah, 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 blah. It is a self-sustaining investment, i.e. it pays more back than that it cost. So not only will it do all of that, but it will raise 3.2 million people out of poverty. So the similar kinds of things, the study, 5 minutes? Oh, wonderful. Okay, I can slow down. Thank you. So the same kind of benefits are available for the Atlantic Canada. So the study also broke it down in different regions, because different regions have different economics, etc. And again, the numbers are there, for Atlantic Canada. I want to go directly to the bottom line. Basic income would be a game changer for the Atlantic Canadian economy. To me, basic income would be the highway to permanent solutions as compared to what we have been doing. So the economic benefits, the lesson is, if we help the people living in poverty, we're helping ourselves. If they do well, we all will be doing well. It's as simple as that. So if there's one thing that I hope to get out of this talk, actually I had two things listed, but I go now back to some of our previous speakers. Leslie mentioned about now her children have children, and we're still dealing with the same problems. Basic income can change a lot of that overnight. She talks about how we have to keep exposing the evidence. I hope some of the numbers that we have here expose the evidence and shown that there is a highway to a solution. And she asked, how can we be leaders in struggling against poverty? I think basic income is a possibility for all of us to be change makers in Canada. All of us, voters, politicians, all of us. Sharon talked about, about the urgent daily needs and about how even doing the best is not a solution. Basic income will not be a solution, but it will definitely tackle one of the fundamental evil reason why we have the problems, and that is lack of money. And Tuma talked about the systematic problems as compared to the individuals. And I think here is a systematic solution. It's within our reach. And if anybody says you can't do it, let me give two examples. One is SERP did it basically overnight. And then they solved the problems that would happen. And we can do the same with basic income. We don't have to put it into place overnight, but hopefully we have it 2 years from now, because we can spend 2 years making it the best system ever, okay? If you ask me what is complicated, I would say putting a subway line through Toronto. Can you think about the huge complications of that? And ask the people in Toronto, they will tell you what the huge complications are. Basic income is nothing compared to that. It's easy. Okay, so I had been hoping that you would all take two things out of that. One is that a basic income is eminently possible. There's nothing that is any more a pipe dream about it. Most, shall we say, puzzle pieces have been put together, and even other puzzle pieces that might still come will only make it better, will even give it a better picture. Secondly, what I hope is that if you ever meet anybody and that says we can't afford it because it costs twice as much as our gross domestic product, that you put them in place and tell them that that is sheer nonsense. Thank you.
I want to give a great big thank you to Pierre and to Sharon, to Mandy and Pierre for their presentation. It's really a passionate presentation, and I always find it fascinating that people that speak numbers can speak with such passion. We hear a lot about our passion for people, but our passion for people connects with the economic realities which are in which poverty is embedded. So it was an interesting and thoughtful presentation that addressed the theme of our conference, which is hope. And where is the hope that something can change and how we can change it? We'll open the floor for questions, and I'm going to call on our time maker. How much time do we have? We'll go to 5:30, and we have an open reception afterwards that I'm hoping people will participate in. I don't know about anybody else, but I've been a closeted COVID person who sees all these familiar faces and can't wait to have conversations. So I'm hoping most of you will be free to join us for a little bit more informal discussion, but we will open it for questions for the next little while. And I think somebody back there is collecting the questions from our online participants. I don't know if anything's come in or not. Welcome, people out there in cyberspace. I'm one of those people that's not used to having people ask questions from some place that might be their bedroom or might be a Nuktatuk or something.
Yes, there's lots of comments on the chat here regarding the absolutely compelling presentation that we just heard. This is, and I'm just reading from the chat, so I hope when I ask Mike and Jaime this, they're not going to throw me out of the room. But we're really fortunate to have this is coming from online, two federal politicians with us today who are really committed to this area and who have done some amazing things here. And the question that's coming online is, how can we help support you to really implement this basic income program? I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, and would Jaime or Mike like to speak to that?
Well, somebody's brave enough to come to the podium.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the question. And once again, thank you for sharing this with us. I know that you guys have presented to us before, and I know that me and Mike have presented to Atlantic Caucus once we saw the child poverty rates as new MPs. We you know, there's certain things we can't discuss about what our colleagues said, but we did talk to our colleagues about the child poverty levels in some of these areas. And I did, on the record, and I do believe Mike did as well, support Julie Durowitz's private member's motion. I did have a conversation with Leah Gazan as well. She subsequently pulled her motion and created an environmental private member's motion as opposed to her one on the basic income guarantee. And I'm very supportive of this. I mean, you know, when you look at these statistics, you know, one of the things that you don't see is that, you know, when we were showing these statistics, when I look at the community that I'm from, Eskasoni, they had a 75% children in poverty area. And that means, you know, when you put that in real thoughts, my son's birthday's tomorrow, and if we invite 16 kids besides my son, that means only 3 aren't living in poverty. So this is something that we've been speaking about. I guess the things that we really need to do is study this. And my biggest question is that I'm supportive of this. But when we talk about basic income guarantee, does income actually show us what is guaranteed in terms of what humans need to survive? One of the most interesting economic theories that I've been reading is Donut Economics by Kate Rawthorne that talks about, you know, there are certain things that every human should be entitled to: clean water, food security, a home, you know, healthcare. These are all things that she says that human beings shouldn't fall below. But there's also a ceiling that which our environment can't handle anymore. And I think that one of the questions that I have, and one of the things that when we've had these discussions on basic income guarantees, is that if you provide the income, does that just change the amount that people are going to be, does that just change the amount where the poverty line is? Does it guarantee, I mean, do landlords then increase their rent? Does water bills go up? Do, the power bills go up? Because people have that ability now to pay for it. And one of the arguments is that if you put too much money into the system, that it actually just creates inflation where all products go up in price. And that's part of modern monetary theory, is to say that the only thing stopping government from putting things out there is that the risk of inflation. And I'm wondering, I know that someone asked us a question on, I guess I better talk about, I guess the more discussion that's had between other members of Parliament all across Canada, not just the ones in high poverty areas. I mean, I look at Sydney, Victoria, we're 10th in Canada in terms of the lowest, where they're the lowest 10 communities in terms of where that's from. And in that community, of that community, I live in the poorest area of that. And so I think it's also important that other MPs be aware of it. And if we look at the makeup of our government, there are several members in Ontario and Quebec and need to be influenced on this and be educated on this. And so in order to say, be able to answer the question first off, is to say that this is something that we're trying to push for, but we need to be able to make the arguments to our members, our caucus members, and we've heard several people talk about this, and most of them talk about the social safety net as opposed to income, because we're not convinced that income, if you create higher income, that it just doesn't create a higher bar for poverty because of all of the prices that go up as a result of inflation and price creators. And so I guess the answer is more awareness of MPs who aren't in the most areas of poverty. But I guess my question that I would have is that how do we respond to the discussion points that say, if we increase the money that goes out there to folks, is there any research or studies that show that inflation doesn't go up everywhere as well, making it just a higher level of poverty based on every services, goods, rent going up as well? And so that's the thing that we've often heard on top of that, and just but in terms of that, I'll give Mike also the chance to have a conversation, because as a former professor at Cape Breton University, you give me a mic, I'll talk all day. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and then hope that answered the question from my behalf, but also I ask a question on that behalf. How do I combat that discussion about the inflation rate going up when you put too much money into the system?
Yeah. Can I answer that question or respond to it? And I'm sure Pierre has a response to it as well. But I always push myself before Pierre. So I thank you for the question. I think it's an important question. It's one, logically you would think, okay, if people have more money, then more money's going to go into the community, and so people will just siphon it off into their pockets. Landlords will siphon it off, business people will siphon it off. Well, my response to that is twofold. First, I think it's really important to recognize that income is important. Income is incredibly important. It can do a lot, but it's not a panacea. It cannot do everything. And so there have to be other acts that can accompany a basic income. So for example, the government in Nova Scotia has just extended the Rent Control Act, or written a Rent Control Act, and extended rent control for 2 years. I don't know all of the details of it, but I do understand that they're also tweaking it because they're beginning to recognize some of the holes in that. That's necessary. To have rent control helps to stop landlords from trying to siphon off money from people who are vulnerable. So laws can help do that. other actions can counteract that. But I would go in another direction as well as responding to that concern, and that is to look at the research, and other people in the room can probably speak to this research as well, but there's research out there that's looked at increases in minimum wage, for example. In Oregon and in Washington, minimum wages were increased incrementally and were meant to go to $15 an hour. And studies were done that showed that there was no commensurate across-the-board increase in the costs of living within those areas. So I think that minimum wage studies help us in that regard. There's a preliminary report from Stockton looking at the pilot for a basic income that also looked at that a little bit and also found the same thing, that there wasn't an across. Now that was just a small segment of the population, but again, the research is suggesting that our fears, the logic that might happen, is not necessarily the reality. But I really do believe that it's important that we act in multiple ways. A basic income is important, but not the only necessary thing, and counteracting those effects with laws and other actions can help.
Thanks, and Bill, I'll stay on time because I see you over there giving the hand signals. Pierre and Mandy, thank you so much for being here. And not only for your passion, but I think creating some literacy around basic income, which is important. And I think this addresses the question that was asked, as what can we do, the pronoun we. And I think there's a couple of things. From a community perspective, we have amazing leadership in this room. And the ability to dock up with your organization to do a deeper dive in terms of a couple of things. One is coordination. One is around collaboration. And another way is communication. So those three things, along with coordination, as I mentioned. I also think what we need to do as a community, as we do that, is create a bigger tent. What I mean by that is incorporate chambers of commerce and other economic development agencies. Because if you look around the world today, everything has an ideological bent. It's right or left. And if you look at this particular concept and practice of basic income, we have right-wing economists supporting basic income. We have left-wing economists supporting basic income. But we also have those that are fearful. And you fear what you don't know. So I think part of this is docking up to organizations like Mandy's and Pierre's, and also working back and forth on the very topic of communication, collaboration, cooperation. And from a federal government perspective, the Liberal Party, the government, is a big tent, so there are those that support it, there are those that need to understand it more, and there are those that may oppose it. But there's also other parties too. And the ability for all of us to work in a real kind of cross-sectional way is really, really important. So all that being said is that Jaime and I are no different than you. We think this is a concept worthy of doing a deep dive and real further exploration. And that's going to take work. It's not going to happen overnight. So, this book that I'm reading is about the infinite and finite, right? So finite is now and you use it up. The infinite is the game goes on for a period of time, a long period of time. But I think together, if we understand that and do what we do best in Cape Breton and northeastern Nova Scotia, because folks online, I'm waving to you in northeastern Nova Scotia, where I have talked about basic income. This is a real interesting concept and practice that we need to co-journey together. So for the person that submitted that question, it is reaching out to your MPs, yes, but it's also reaching out to your organizations that are represented here, your municipalities, your provincial governments. I mean, look at Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward Island has signed a memorandum of understanding, all parties within the legislature and PEI, to work together on this. So it's going to take that effort, and it's going to take that education, and it's going to take hard work, and it's not going to be easy, but nothing truly is. So I want to say thank you for coming and thank you for inviting me last week. I did participate here and there online. But take some time, folks. Talk to Pierre, talk to Mandy, talk about how Cape Breton University can play a fundamental role in this. Talk about how your organizations can play a fundamental role. Jaime and I are there, and we're a part of, I like to think, the solution, but it's all of us. So thank you.
I appreciate that, and I agree that it's hard work, but I believe that it will be done in 2 years, so no, with everybody's help. Yes, I just wanted to say that I agree with you that there's that people from all political stripes support a basic income. But I also think that it's of critical importance, and that's why I started my talk today with this. We really need to talk about the basic income that we want, because there are different views of a basic income, and we need to fight as hard as we possibly can for a progressive basic income that makes the sort of changes that we want to see for people who are really struggling now. So. Yeah, a basic income that replaces a bunch of social services? No, that's not appropriate. A basic income that keeps in place this punitive oversight? No, that's not appropriate. So we really do have to talk about the basic income we want to see and help shape the people's minds in that regard. So, but I just wanted to say one other thing, and I really think it's important for all of us to be working together, and the more that Basic Income Nova Scotia and Coalition Canada and Basic Income Canada Network can help in any way with local organizations and any way we can collaborate, we look forward to that. And we look forward to working with the MPs in the room to move this forward in whatever way we can. So. Did you want to say that?
That was really interesting. Thank you very much for that presentation. And I've got a question for both Mike and Jamie, or Jaime, sorry. I thank you for your hard work so far and your past hard work. Is there right now a standing committee to look into basic income in Canada? Is there a standing committee at all that's looking into this? I know there's talk about it, but is there actually a committee that's doing that work right now? Right, okay, so what I can't see what the problem is here is that we're talking systemic. I have a friend of mine that said to me when they came out with CERB and everybody said, how are we going to pay for that? And he says, don't worry about it. We've got that. Trudeau's got that. He said, we just finished paying off the Second World War. We can kick this down the road another way, you know? So just kick it down the road another 20 or 30 years. But I'm saying to you is let's get going with this now. I mean, having one in caucus, just your caucus, is not really out there, is it? It's really got to be a government priority. You know, we're in a state now that we should have coalition government. I know that's fearful for certain members of Canada, but you know, Finland, Denmark, and those places have coalition governments, and so I can't see why you couldn't afford, maybe it's not a coalition government, but a coalition on this question, because I think it's very important, and I think we should move on and have the pros and cons and figure it out. Anyway, that's my comment. Thank you. Thank you.
If people feel that their questions have percolated and been answered to the degree we're able to in our room, I think it might be appropriate to thank our guests, and I don't know if our co-chairs have a closing remark to make, but I'm certainly hoping that most of you will join us for a more informal discussion afterwards.
Well, I want to talk about time, because one of the things that I think is really obvious to us today already is that in some ways in this conference, time is not our friend, because this is really important discussion. And I think we are already so thrilled. We know we have lined up a powerhouse of speakers.